How does a ghost overthrow a king? How does a condemned infant, rescued from a river in a tale so old it feels borrowed from myth itself, rise to shatter the most powerful empire of his time? This is not merely a story of ambition, it is the story of an idea born in the rugged mountains of Pars, an idea that would redraw the map of the known world. Before Cyrus the Great, empires were built on a simple, brutal principle: conquer, enslave, and plunder. The Assyrians had perfected this art, leaving behind a legacy of terror carved in stone. Their kings boasted of flaying rebels alive and piling skulls into pyramids. Power was a hammer and the world was a nail. Yet from the vassal kingdom of the Persians, a new power was stirring, one that would not just conquer, but captivate. The Median king Astyages was said to have dreamt of a vine growing from his daughter that overshadowed all of Asia, a prophecy he tried to sever by ordering the death of his own grandson Cyrus. But history, it seems, has a fondness for recycled narratives. The story of a baby cast adrift only to be saved and raised in secret echoes through the ages, from Sargon of Akkad to Moses of the Israelites. Was this destiny? Or was it a carefully constructed piece of political theatre, a founding myth for a man who understood that a crown won by the sword must be held by something far stronger, a story? The Medes were the masters, the Persians their kinsmen and subjects, but the relationship had soured. Astyages ruled with a cruel and capricious hand. For the Persian nobility and for the young Cyrus, who had by now been discovered and returned to his family, the yoke of the Medes was becoming unbearable. This was not a rebellion of slaves against masters, it was a family feud on an imperial scale, a civil war. The decisive clash came at the Battle of Pasargadae. This was no grand, orderly confrontation of disciplined legions. Imagine instead a swirling, desperate melee in the mountain passes. Herodotus tells us the fate of the battle hung by a thread, until Cyrus, in a stroke of psychological genius, shamed his retreating soldiers by asking if they intended to run back to their women. He rallied them, turning the tide not just with steel, but with words. Yet his true genius was revealed in the aftermath. Where an Assyrian king would have massacred the Median nobles, Cyrus embraced them. He declared Medes and Persians to be partners in a new venture. His grandfather Astyages was spared, allowed to live out his days in quiet dignity. This was unthinkable. It was revolutionary. A king who rules by fear builds his throne on sand. A king who rules by loyalty carves it from the mountain itself. This act of clemency was not a sign of weakness. It was the foundational stone of a new kind of empire. Cyrus understood a profound truth about power. A conquered enemy is a future rebel, but a willing partner is an asset. He did not seek to erase the cultures he absorbed, he sought to co-opt their strengths. The Median cavalry, the finest in the world, became the elite vanguard of his new army. Their administrators, with generations of experience in governing, were integrated into his court. He was not just a Persian king who had conquered the Medes. He was creating something new, a dual monarchy, a synthesis of two peoples. This was the engine he would use to drive his ambition. The world was a chessboard of ancient, wealthy, and decadent kingdoms. To the west lay the Lydian Empire, a land so rich its king's name, Croesus, would become a synonym for wealth. To the south lay the colossal eternal prize of Babylon, the greatest city in the world, protected by walls said to be impenetrable. Cyrus looked upon them not with the eyes of a plunderer, but with the vision of an architect. He was not building a kingdom, he was building the world. And the world, lost in its own petty squabbles and comfortable traditions, had no idea what was coming. The whispers from the mountains of Pars were about to become a roar that would shake the foundations of civilization. This new model of governance, this radical idea of an empire built on cooperation rather than subjugation, was about to be put to its ultimate test. It had unified the Iranian plateau, but could it conquer the ancient and powerful civilizations of the wider world? What is more valuable to a ruler, an invincible army, or an idea for which people are willing to voluntarily die? The answer would come swiftly, written in the fall of kingdoms that had stood for centuries. Cyrus was not merely a warrior, he was a master of psychological warfare, a man who conquered minds before he conquered cities. He inherited the Median throne, but it was the idea of a new world order that he would have to defend and expand. This idea was his sharpest weapon, and his first target was the man whose name was synonymous with gold itself, King Croesus of Lydia. The confrontation between these two men was a clash of titans, a battle not just of armies, but of philosophies. Croesus was the epitome of old money and established power, confident in his wealth and the cryptic pronouncements of his gods. He famously tested the oracles of the ancient world, and only the oracle at Delphi passed, correctly identifying that he was boiling a tortoise and a lamb in a bronze cauldron. Convinced of its power, he asked the oracle if he should attack Persia. The answer came, wrapped in the infuriating ambiguity that kept prophets in business for centuries. If Croesus crossed the Halys River, he would destroy a great empire. He saw this as a divine green light. Gathering his forces, which included formidable Lydian cavalry and Greek mercenaries, he marched east. The initial clash at Tyria was a bloody stalemate. Thinking the campaign season was over, as was customary, Croesus retreated to his capital Sardis and dismissed his mercenary troops for the winter. It was a fatal mistake. Cyrus did not play by the old rules. He did not respect the campaigning season. He did what no one expected. He pursued Croesus through the harsh winter landscape, arriving before the walls of Sardis with a speed that seemed supernatural. The panicked Croesus scraped together what forces he had and met the Persians on the plain of Thymbra. It was here that Cyrus deployed another of his masterstrokes of unconventional warfare. Knowing the Lydian cavalry horses were unnerved by the smell and appearance of camels, he placed his baggage camels in the front line. The Lydian horses, the pride of their army, panicked, broke rank, and fled, unseating their riders. The Lydian army collapsed. Sardis was besieged and fell within 14 days. The great empire that was destroyed, as the oracle had foretold, was Croesus's own. And in the aftermath, Cyrus once again demonstrated his revolutionary philosophy. Croesus was not executed. He was brought before Cyrus and, according to legend, became a trusted, if melancholy, advisor at the Persian court. The conqueror was collecting not just territory but wisdom. With Lydia secured, the Persian gaze turned south, toward the ultimate prize, Babylon. The city was a legend, the heart of Mesopotamian civilization, for millennia. Its outer walls were said to be over 80 feet thick, with a moat so wide it was more like a lake. Inside, the hanging gardens were a wonder of the world, and the ziggurat of Marduk, the infamous Tower of Babel, reached for the heavens. A direct assault was suicide. A siege could last for years, a generation even. So how did Babylon fall in a single night without a single drop of Persian blood being shed on its walls? The answer lies not in military might, but in a brilliant campaign of propaganda and political subversion. The reigning king of Babylon, Nabonidus, was deeply unpopular. An eccentric scholar king, he had neglected the chief god of the city, Marduk, in favor of the moon god Sin. This was a profound insult to the powerful and wealthy priesthood of Marduk. For years, Persian agents had been inside the city, cultivating dissent, spreading promises. They portrayed Cyrus not as a foreign conqueror, but as a liberator chosen by Marduk himself to restore tradition and order. The ground was being prepared for a conquest of hearts and minds. The culmination of this strategy was a masterpiece of timing and audacity. While the city celebrated a religious festival with much of its garrison drunk and distracted, Persian troops diverted the flow of the Euphrates River, which ran through the heart of Babylon. With the water level lowered to little more than thigh-deep, Cyrus's elite soldiers, the Immortals, simply waded into the city under the cover of darkness. The Babylonian priests, seeing their moment, opened the inner gates from within. The invincible city fell without a fight. The highest walls cannot protect a city from an idea whose time has come. When Cyrus entered Babylon in the year 539 before the Common Era, he did not come as a destroyer. He performed the religious rites for Marduk, positioning himself as a legitimate successor to the Babylonian throne. And it was here that he commissioned an artifact that would echo through history, the Cyrus cylinder. This small clay barrel, inscribed with Akkadian cuneiform, is arguably the world's first charter of human rights. It declared the abolition of slavery, freedom of religion for all peoples within the city, and the right of displaced peoples to return to their homelands. He allowed the Jews, exiled in Babylon for decades, to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. Cyrus was not just a conqueror, he was a liberator, a state builder on a scale never before imagined. He had built the physical empire, but his son and heir, Cambyses II, would inherit the far more complex task of running this colossal, multicultural machine and conquering its last great rival, the ancient, mystical land of Egypt. An empire stretching from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea is not ruled by armies alone. It is ruled by roads, by messages, and by a ruthlessly efficient bureaucracy. The Achaemenid Empire, consolidated after the death of the great Cyrus, was a marvel of ancient engineering and administration. At its heart was the Royal Road, a highway stretching over 1,600 miles from the city of Susa in Persia to the port of Sardis in Anatolia. It was more than just a road, it was the empire's central nervous system. Along its length, at regular intervals, were posting stations, manned and equipped with fresh horses. This was the home of the Angarium, the imperial postal service, a relay system of riders so swift that the Greek historian Herodotus wrote of them in awe. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. A message could cross the empire in as little as 7 days, a speed that would not be surpassed in the region until the invention of the telegraph more than 2 millennia later. This network allowed the King of Kings to project his power, to receive intelligence, and to crush rebellions before they could fester. It was the backbone of a state that governed dozens of different peoples, each with their own gods, languages, and traditions. And now this mighty engine of conquest was aimed at the last great power of the ancient world, the kingdom of the pharaohs. Cyrus's son, Cambyses II, had a heavy burden to bear. Following a legend is a thankless task. He set his sights on Egypt, a land of immense wealth and prestige, a civilization that was ancient when the Persians were still nomadic tribesmen. The invasion in 525 before the Common Era was meticulously planned. Cambyses secured an alliance with the Arab chiefs who controlled the deserts, ensuring his army would have water during the perilous crossing of the Sinai. He built a navy with the help of his Phoenician and Greek subjects to challenge Egyptian sea power. The decisive Battle of Pelusium was another example of Persian psychological warfare. Knowing the Egyptians venerated cats as sacred animals associated with the goddess Bastet, Cambyses ordered his soldiers to paint cats on their shields, and according to one account, to drive a herd of cats and other sacred animals before them. The Egyptian soldiers, fearing they would harm the sacred beasts and incur divine wrath, were hesitant to fight back. The Persian victory was swift and complete. Egypt, the land that had resisted invaders for 3,000 years, fell and became a satrapy of the Persian Empire. But conquering Egypt was one thing, holding it was another. The story of Cambyses in Egypt, as told by Greek historians, is one of madness and sacrilege. They claim he descended into a paranoid rage, that he desecrated temples, mocked Egyptian religious customs, and even stabbed the sacred Apis bull, a living manifestation of a god. But is this the full story? Or is it a smear campaign written by his enemies? Egyptian sources are less clear. It is more likely that Cambyses, a pragmatic Zoroastrian, clashed with the immensely powerful and wealthy Egyptian priesthood who saw him as a foreign heretic. He may have curtailed their tax exemptions and seized temple lands, acts which would have been seen as sacrilege and earned him their eternal enmity. The truth is likely buried under layers of propaganda. What we know for certain is that while Cambyses was bogged down in Egypt and campaigning in Nubia, disaster struck at the heart of the empire. A magus, a priest named Gaumata, who bore a striking resemblance to Cambyses' deceased brother Bardia, seized the Persian throne. He claimed to be the brother whom Cambyses had secretly murdered years earlier. The empire, weary of Cambyses' long absence and lured by Gaumata's promises of tax cuts, flocked to the impostor's banner. An empire is a fragile beast. It can survive a dozen wars but die from a single lie whispered in the right ear. Cambyses, rushing back to Persia to confront the usurper, died mysteriously in Syria. Some say it was an accident, a self-inflicted wound from his own sword. Others whisper of suicide or assassination. The empire was leaderless in the hands of a lie and teetering on the brink of total collapse. From this chaos, a new figure would emerge, a man with a distant claim to the throne, a will of iron, and 7 co-conspirators with very sharp daggers. Who was Darius? Was he the rightful heir, the avenger of the Achaemenid line, as he would later carve into a cliff face for all eternity to see? Or was he a brilliant, ruthless opportunist, a distant cousin of the royal family who seized a moment of supreme crisis to stage a bloody coup d'etat? The truth, as always, is a matter of perspective. The official story, the one Darius commissioned, is a thriller of patriotism and righteous fury. He tells us that upon learning of the impostor Gaumata, he gathered 6 of the most powerful Persian nobles, and together they rode to the fortress where the false king was hiding. In a daring raid, they snuck into the palace and confronted the usurper. A desperate fight ensued in the darkened chambers, a chaotic struggle where Darius had to strike in the gloom, careful not to kill one of his own men. He did not hesitate. He slew Gaumata and his followers and rode out to present himself as the savior of Persia. It is a magnificent story. It is also almost certainly a carefully constructed piece of political propaganda. Many modern historians believe that the man on the throne was not an impostor at all, but the real Bardia, and that Darius was the usurper who murdered the legitimate king and invented the story of Gaumata to justify his actions. We will never know for sure. What we do know is that the death of the man on the throne did not bring peace. It unleashed a firestorm. The empire exploded. With the central authority in question, nearly every major province declared its independence. Babylon revolted twice. Elam, Media, Parthia, Assyria, Egypt all rose up against the new self-proclaimed king. Darius's first year on the throne was not one of coronations and feasting, but of ceaseless, brutal warfare. He was a man possessed, a whirlwind of military energy. The official record, which he had carved 300 feet up a sheer cliff face at Behistun, is a chilling testament to his methods. It is an autobiography written in stone and blood. In it he lists the pretender kings he defeated and details their fates with grim satisfaction. One was captured, had his nose, ears, and tongue cut off, was put on display, and then impaled. Another was flayed alive, his skin stuffed with straw. In a single year, Darius fought 19 battles and crushed 9 rebellies. It was a campaign of terror, designed not just to defeat his enemies, but to annihilate the very idea of resistance. He was stitching the empire back together with a thread of iron and fear. Can absolute power fail to corrupt even the wisest of men? Darius was proving that sometimes absolute power is the only thing that can forge order out of chaos. Having secured his throne through bloodshed, Darius then proved himself to be a genius of administration, perhaps even greater than Cyrus himself. He did not just restore the empire, he reinvented it. He divided the vast territory into 20 satrapies or provinces, each governed by a satrap or governor. But crucially, he created a system of checks and balances. Alongside the satrap in each province were a military commander and a chief financial officer, who both answered directly to the king. He also created a network of spies, the eyes and ears of the king, who roamed the empire, ensuring the loyalty of his officials. This was a system designed to prevent any one man from accumulating enough power to challenge the throne. He introduced the daric, a standardized gold coin, the first of its kind, which facilitated trade and taxation across his vast domain. He completed the canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea, a feat of engineering that pharaohs had dreamed of for centuries. And near the ancient heartland of Pars, he began construction of a new ceremonial capital, a city that would be the jewel of his empire, Persepolis, a place of breathtaking beauty, designed to awe foreign dignitaries and proclaim the eternal power of the Achaemenid king. Darius was not just a king, he was the architect of the mature Persian Empire, the man who gave it the structure and stability that would allow it to endure for another 2 centuries. He had stared into the abyss of civil war and emerged as the undisputed master of the world. But his gaze was now turning west, toward a collection of fractious, argumentative, and fiercely independent city-states on the fringe of his domain. The Greeks had helped his enemies in a recent rebellion. It was a slight he would not forget. A storm was gathering over the Aegean. Did Darius save the Persian Empire from chaos only to become a ruthless tyrant? Or was his iron fist the necessary price for peace and order? Tell us what you believe. Was he a savior or a tyrant? Leave your judgment in the comments. We read every single one. The world of the early 5th century before the Common Era was a world of one superpower. The Achaemenid Empire, reforged and strengthened by the iron will of Darius the Great, was a global hegemon. It controlled the trade routes, the grain supplies, and the gold mines. From its perspective, the world was divided into 2 parts, the empire itself and the barbarian fringe. And on that western fringe lay a peninsula of rugged mountains and jagged coastlines, inhabited by a people who called themselves Hellenes. The Persians saw them as a collection of petty, squabbling city-states, good for little more than producing skilled mercenaries and fine pottery. They were an afterthought. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. For the Greeks, and especially for the Athenians, a new and dangerous idea was taking root: democracy, the notion that citizens should rule themselves. The Greeks built a democracy for the chosen few, and the Persians an empire for all. History has shown that both ideas were too fragile for human ambitions. These 2 worlds, the monolithic centralized empire and the decentralized chaotic world of the Greek polis, were on a collision course, and the spark that lit the fuse was a revolt in a place called Ionia. The Greek cities along the coast of Anatolia, in the region of Ionia, had been under Persian rule for decades. They prospered under the Pax Persica, but they chafed under the Persian-appointed tyrants who governed them. In 499 before the Common Era, spurred on by the ambitious tyrant of Miletus, Aristagoras, the Ionian cities rose in rebellion. It was a bold but foolish move. Alone, they stood no chance. They needed help from mainland Greece. They appealed to Sparta, the preeminent military power, but the Spartans, ever cautious and pragmatic, looked at a map, saw the distance to Persia, and wisely declined. But in Athens they found a more receptive audience. The young Athenian democracy, full of revolutionary fervor, saw the Ionians as brethren fighting for freedom. They sent a token force of 20 ships. It was a small gesture, but it would have earth-shattering consequences. Together with the Ionian rebels, the Athenians marched inland and did something unthinkable. They captured and burned Sardis, the provincial capital, one of the great cities of the Persian Empire. For Darius, sitting in his palace at Susa, this was more than a military setback. It was a profound personal insult. A group of upstarts from a backwater city had burned his city. Legend says he ordered a servant to repeat a single phrase to him 3 times at every meal. "Master, remember the Athenians." The Ionian revolt was eventually crushed. The Persian fleet smashed the rebel navy at the Battle of Lade, and the city of Miletus was razed to the ground. But the Athenian involvement had changed everything. It was no longer a local rebellion, it was an international incident. Darius could not let the challenge stand. The honor of the king and the stability of the empire demanded that Athens be punished. In 490 before the Common Era, he dispatched a major punitive expedition across the Aegean. This was not an invasion force meant to conquer Greece. It was a powerful task force designed to install a pro-Persian tyrant in Athens and to make an example of the city. The Persian fleet, guided by Hippias, the exiled former tyrant of Athens, landed at a wide, crescent-shaped bay on the coast of Attica. The place was called Marathon. The Athenians were in a state of panic. They sent a runner, Phidippides, to Sparta to beg for help. But the Spartans were in the middle of a religious festival and could not march until the full moon. The Athenians were on their own, save for a small contingent from the brave city of Plataea. At Marathon, a small army of perhaps 10,000 Athenian citizen soldiers, known as hoplites, stood against a Persian force at least twice its size, maybe more. For several days, the two armies faced each other across the plain. The Athenians, led by the brilliant general Miltiades, knew that a frontal assault against the superior Persian numbers and cavalry was suicide. But Miltiades had a plan. He knew the Persians typically placed their best troops in the center. He did the opposite. He deliberately weakened his own center and packed his best hoplites onto the wings. Then he gave the order to advance. The Athenians did something no one had ever done before against a Persian army. They charged at a run. This charge across nearly a mile of open ground was designed to minimize the time they were exposed to the deadly rain of Persian arrows. The two lines crashed together. As expected, the weak Athenian center buckled and began to fall back under the pressure of the elite Persian infantry. But on the flanks, the powerful Athenian wings crushed their opposition, and then, instead of pursuing the fleeing enemies, they performed a difficult and disciplined maneuver. They turned inward, enveloping the Persian center in a classic double pincer. The elite Persian troops, who thought they were winning, suddenly found themselves attacked from three sides. Panic set in. The Persian line shattered. They broke and ran for their ships with the Athenians in hot pursuit. By the end of the day, over 6,000 Persians lay dead on the beach at Marathon. The Athenians had lost only 192 men. It was a stunning, almost unbelievable victory. It was the first time a Greek army had defeated the Persians on land, shattering the myth of their invincibility. For Persia, it was a humiliating but minor setback. For Athens, it was a moment that would define their civilization, a victory for freedom and democracy that would inspire them for generations. But in Susa, Darius began planning a second, far larger invasion. He would not forget the Athenians, and his son, Xerxes, would inherit his father's vow of revenge. The defeat at Marathon was a sting, an irritation, but for the vast Persian Empire, it was hardly a mortal wound. Darius the Great began preparations for a second, much larger invasion, one designed not merely to punish Athens but to subjugate all of Greece. But a revolt in Egypt and his own death delayed the plan. The thirst for revenge was bequeathed to his son and successor, Xerxes I. Xerxes was not a warrior king in the mold of Cyrus or Darius. He was a man born to immense wealth and power, a connoisseur of grand gestures, and the invasion of Greece was to be his masterpiece. This would be no mere punitive expedition. This would be the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever seen. The numbers reported by Herodotus are fantastical, over 5 million people in total, but even modern estimates suggest an army of several 100,000 soldiers and a fleet of over 1,200 ships. It was a logistical nightmare, a city on the march, and it was all aimed at a tiny collection of city-states that could not even agree to unite in their own defense. Xerxes was so confident, so consumed by hubris, that he ordered a canal to be dug through the Athos Peninsula to avoid a stormy cape that had wrecked a previous fleet. And when a storm destroyed his pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, the strait separating Asia from Europe, he famously ordered the water itself to be whipped 300 times and to have fetters thrown into it, a symbolic punishment for its disobedience. As the Persian juggernaut moved south through northern Greece in 480 before the Common Era, the Greek world was gripped by terror. Many city-states simply submitted, offering the symbolic gifts of earth and water. But a small coalition of states led by Sparta and Athens resolved to resist. They knew they could not defeat the massive Persian army on an open plain. Their only hope was to use the terrain to their advantage, to find a narrow pass where the Persian numbers would count for nothing. They chose a place where the mountains came down almost to the sea, a narrow track called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. Here, the Spartan king, Leonidas, with his 300 elite Spartan bodyguards and a few thousand other Greek allies, prepared to make a stand. For 3 days, this tiny force held back the might of the Persian Empire. The narrowness of the pass turned the battle into a meat grinder, where the Persians' superior numbers were useless. Xerxes threw wave after wave of his best troops, including his elite immortals, against the Greek shield wall, and wave after wave was repulsed with horrific casualties. But the Greek position was ultimately betrayed. A local man named Ephialtes showed the Persians a hidden mountain path that would allow them to outflank the defenders. When Leonidas realized he was surrounded, he dismissed most of the allied troops, ordering them to retreat and prepare for the next fight. He and his 300 Spartans, along with 700 Thespians who refused to leave, remained behind to fight to the death, a suicidal last stand to buy time for the rest of Greece. They fought until their spears were broken, then with their swords, and finally with their bare hands and teeth, until every last one of them was killed. The sacrifice at Thermopylae was a military defeat, but it became a moral victory of immense proportions, a legend of courage that has inspired soldiers for millennia. But in the short term, it opened the road to Athens. The city was evacuated. The Athenian leader, Themistocles, a brilliant populist and naval strategist, convinced his people to put their faith not in their city walls, but in their wooden walls, their fleet of warships, the triremes. The Persian army marched into Athens and, on Xerxes' orders, burned it to the ground. The Acropolis was destroyed, the temples were looted. From the nearby island of Salamis, the Athenians watched their city burn. For Xerxes, this was the culmination of his campaign. He had avenged the burning of Sardis, he had fulfilled his father's vow. But Themistocles had one more card to play. He lured the massive and unwieldy Persian fleet into the narrow straits between Salamis and the mainland. It was a trap. In the cramped waters, the Persians' numerical superiority was once again nullified. The smaller, more maneuverable Greek triremes with their bronze rams ran circles around the Persian ships, ramming and sinking them at will. The Battle of Salamis was a catastrophe for the Persian navy. Xerxes, watching from a golden throne set up on the shore, saw his invincible fleet destroyed before his eyes. The naval defeat at Salamis was the turning point of the war. With his fleet shattered, Xerxes could no longer guarantee the supply lines for his massive army. Fearing he would be trapped in Europe, he took the bulk of his army and retreated back to Asia, leaving his general Mardonius with a still large force to complete the conquest the following year. But the psychological blow had been struck. The momentum had shifted. The following year, at the Battle of Plataea, the combined Greek army, led by the Spartans, decisively defeated and killed Mardonius, while the remnants of the Persian fleet were destroyed at Mycale on the same day. The great invasion was over. Xerxes returned to Persia not as a triumphant conqueror, but as a defeated and humiliated king. The invasion that was meant to be his crowning glory had become a colossal failure. The giant had been humbled by the underdog. The empire was not critically wounded, but its aura of invincibility was gone forever. And inside the opulent palaces of Susa and Persepolis, the failure in the west would have deadly consequences. The daggers were coming out. Power was about to shift from the battlefield to the shadowy corridors of the royal harem. The decades following the disastrous Greek campaign were, on the surface, a golden age. The empire was at its largest territorial extent. Wealth from across the known world poured into the royal treasuries at Susa and Persepolis, but the defeat in Greece had planted a seed of doubt, a hairline crack in the foundation of Achaemenid power. The King of Kings, the ruler of the world, had been defied and defeated by a handful of small cities. This loss of prestige was a dangerous political reality. Xerxes, the great builder, retreated into a massive construction program, lavishing fortunes on his palaces, perhaps to mask his military failure with architectural splendor. But a king who loses a war often loses the respect of his court, and in the Persian court, disrespect was a death sentence. The real power began to shift away from the throne room and into the labyrinthine world of the royal harem, a place of whispering eunuchs, ambitious queens, and bitter succession rivalries. The empire was like a magnificent fruit, beautiful and ripe on the outside, but slowly beginning to rot from within. The court of the Achaemenid kings was a viper's nest of intrigue. The king had many wives and even more concubines, resulting in a bewildering number of potential heirs, all vying for power. The most dangerous figures were often not the princes themselves, but their mothers, the queen dowagers, who would stop at nothing to see their own son on the throne. Alongside them were the court eunuchs, men who could not father their own dynasties and were thus seen as trustworthy, but who often amassed immense personal power and wealth as chamberlains, advisors, and kingmakers. One of the most powerful men in the empire was the commander of the royal bodyguard, a position of ultimate trust. In 465 before the Common Era, that position was held by a man named Artabanus. In a palace conspiracy that remains murky to this day, Artabanus, possibly in league with the chief eunuch, assassinated Xerxes the Great king, murdering him in his own bedchamber. It was a shocking act of treason. Artabanus then cleverly framed the king's eldest son and heir, Crown Prince Darius, for the murder. Xerxes' younger son, Artaxerxes, was manipulated into believing his brother was the killer, and, in a fit of rage, Artaxerxes killed his own brother, avenging a crime he did not commit. Artabanus had cleared the path to the throne for a young, pliable king whom he believed he could control. For a brief time, Artabanus was the de facto ruler of the Persian Empire. His ambition, however, was his undoing. He overplayed his hand, attempting to assassinate the young Artaxerxes as well, so he could seize the throne for himself. But Artaxerxes was warned and, in a dramatic confrontation, killed the treacherous bodyguard. The young king had secured his throne, but the precedent was terrifying. The King of Kings was not inviolable. He could be murdered in his sleep. This single event destabilized the court for generations. A dagger in the back can be more frightening than an enemy's sword. The long reign of Artaxerxes I was marked by constant internal strife and external revolts, most notably a major rebellion in Egypt, which, with Athenian help, raged for years. The empire was still immensely powerful, its resources seemingly limitless, but its focus was turning inward. The great kings who had built the empire were gone. They were replaced by a succession of weaker rulers who were often puppets in the hands of powerful courtiers, queens and satraps. The centrifugal forces that Cyrus and Darius had so brilliantly managed were beginning to pull the empire apart. The satraps in the provinces far from the prying eyes of the king began to act like independent monarchs, raising their own armies and conducting their own foreign policy. The empire was becoming a collection of semi-independent kingdoms, held together only by the theoretical authority of a distant and often ineffectual king. The poison of intrigue that had killed Xerxes was now spreading through the veins of the entire imperial body. When the heart of an empire is sick with paranoia and betrayal, how long can its limbs remain strong? Is the greatest threat to a superpower a defiant external enemy, or the slow creeping disease of internal decay? Share your diagnosis in the comments section. Your insights are part of the historical record. For nearly a century after the Greek Wars, a tense, unofficial Cold War existed between Persia and the Greek city-states. The empire, having learned its lesson, rarely resorted to direct military invasion. Instead, it wielded a far more subtle and effective weapon: gold. Persian darics flooded into Greece, fueling the endemic rivalries between Athens, Sparta, and Thebes. Why fight the Greeks when you could pay them to fight each other? This policy, known as the King's Peace, kept Greece divided and weak, unable to pose a threat to Persian interests in Anatolia. It was a cynical but brilliant strategy, but this reliance on mercenaries and diplomacy masked a deeper military weakness. The heart of the Persian army, the native Persian and Median infantry, had lost its edge. The empire had become dangerously reliant on foreign soldiers, particularly Greek hoplites, who were considered the finest infantry in the world. And in 401 before the Common Era, this dependency would lead to an event that exposed the empire's internal rot for all to see: the incredible march of the 10,000. The story begins, as so many Persian stories do, with a fraternal rivalry. When King Darius II died, he left the throne to his eldest son, Artaxerxes II. But his younger son, Cyrus, known as Cyrus the Younger, was his mother's favorite. Ambitious, charismatic, and popular, Cyrus was the satrap of a wealthy region in Anatolia. He believed the throne was rightfully his, and he began to plot a rebellion against his brother. To do this, he needed an army, a corps of elite troops that could defeat the royal army and its own Greek mercenaries. So he did what any wealthy Persian noble would do. He went shopping for soldiers in Greece. He secretly recruited an army of over 10,000 Greek hoplites, a hardened corps of professional soldiers, veterans of the Peloponnesian War. He told them he was hiring them to fight some troublesome mountain tribes. The Greeks, well-paid and eager for adventure, signed on. Only when they had marched deep into the heart of Mesopotamia, hundreds of miles from the sea, did Cyrus reveal his true objective: to march on Babylon and seize the throne of the Persian Empire. The Greeks were trapped. To turn back was impossible. Their only hope of survival was to stick with Cyrus and hope he won. The two brothers and their armies met at the Battle of Cunaxa, not far from Babylon. The 10,000 Greeks deployed on the right flank of Cyrus's army did exactly what they were paid to do. They smashed the Persian troops opposite them and drove them from the field. On their side of the battle, the victory was total and complete. But Cyrus, in the center, saw his brother Artaxerxes and, in a moment of rash personal fury, charged directly at him. He managed to wound the king but was surrounded and killed. With the death of their leader, the battle was over. The rebellion had failed. For the 10,000 Greeks, the situation was catastrophic. They were victorious but stranded, abandoned 1,000 miles from home, in the center of the largest and most hostile empire in the world. The Persian commanders invited the Greek generals to a peace conference, offered them safe passage, and then, in an act of profound treachery, murdered them all. The Persian king assumed that this leaderless army of foreigners would simply surrender or be annihilated. He was wrong. The Greeks did something extraordinary. They held an impromptu election on the battlefield and chose new leaders, among them an Athenian soldier and historian named Xenophon, who would later write an immortal account of their journey, the Anabasis. What followed was one of the greatest adventure stories in history. Led by their new commanders, the 10,000 refused to surrender. They began an epic fighting march north toward the Black Sea, the only route back to the Greek world. They were pursued by Persian armies, harassed by hostile tribes, and battered by the harsh landscape and brutal winter weather. They were an army without a country, a moving republic of soldiers, making their own laws and fighting for their own survival. They fought their way through the mountains of Kurdistan and the snows of Armenia. And after months of unimaginable hardship, they finally reached a mountain from which they could see the water. Xenophon describes the moment the men at the front of the column began to shout, "Thalata! Thalata! The sea! The sea!" It was a pure, unadulterated relief and triumph. They had made it. The March of the 10,000 was more than just a heroic saga. It was a revelation. It proved that a small, disciplined army of heavy infantry could march with impunity to the very heart of the Persian Empire and back again. It showed that the great Achaemenid colossus, for all its wealth and size, stood on feet of clay. The king could not control his own territory. The story was read avidly all over Greece, and in the kingdom of Macedonia to the north, A young prince named Philip, and later his son Alexander, would read it with particular interest. The empire had just shown its enemies the blueprint for its own destruction. The final century of the Achaemenid Empire was an age of contradictions. The court in Susa and Persepolis glittered with a wealth that was almost beyond comprehension, yet the foundations of the state were crumbling. The story of the 10,000 had exposed the empire's military vulnerability, and its political instability was becoming chronic. The most persistent thorn in the side of the great king was Egypt. The land of the pharaohs had never truly accepted Persian rule. It rose in rebellion again and again, draining the empire's treasury and military resources for decades. For nearly 60 years, Egypt managed to maintain its independence, a constant bleeding wound on the empire's southern flank. This weakness was not lost on the Greeks. The king's peace, the policy of keeping Greece divided with Persian gold, began to fray. Ambitious Greek leaders started to talk openly of a pan-Hellenic crusade, a war of revenge against Persia to liberate the Ionian Greeks and plunder the legendary wealth of the East. The empire was an aging giant, still powerful, still capable of swatting down its enemies, but it was slow, tired, and surrounded by hungry, young predators. An empire is never more vulnerable than when it believes its own propaganda of invincibility. Into this era of slow decline came one last, terrifying resurgence of Achaemenid power in the form of Artaxerxes III, also known as Ocus. He came to the throne in 358 before the Common Era through a bloody palace purge, executing most of his relatives to secure his position. Ocus was a man who understood only one language, brute force. He was a throwback to the ruthless Assyrian kings of old. He decided that the only way to save the decaying empire was through a reign of terror. He set about systematically crushing every rebellion and sign of dissent. His primary goal was the reconquest of Egypt, which had defied his predecessors for 2 generations. His first attempt failed, which only encouraged more rebellions across the empire in Phoenicia and Cyprus. Ocus responded with overwhelming and merciless violence. He besieged the city of Sidon, which had led the Phoenician revolt. When the city fell, its desperate citizens, rather than face his wrath, chose to lock themselves in their houses and burn their city to the ground, a mass suicide of 40,000 people. Ocus then marched on Egypt with a massive army, including tens of thousands of Greek mercenaries. This time, he was successful. He reconquered the Nile Valley, plundered its temples, and installed a regime so brutal that it would be remembered with hatred for centuries. Through sheer terror, Artaxerxes III had managed to restore the empire to the approximate borders it had held under Darius the Great. He had stopped the bleeding. He had reasserted the power of the central throne. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the Achaemenid giant had been roused from its slumber. But this stability was built on fear, not loyalty, and it was fragile. Ocus had made countless enemies. In 338, before the Common Era, he was assassinated, poisoned by his ambitious vizier, the eunuch Bagoas, who had become the kingmaker of the Persian court. Bagoas then placed Ocus's youngest son on the throne, only to poison him as well a few years later when he proved too independent. Finally, he elevated a distant relative of the royal house to the throne, a man named Darius III. This Darius was a decent and courageous man, but he was a mediocre general and an indecisive ruler, inheriting a throne that had been drenched in blood and poison. He was precisely the wrong man at the wrong time. Because while Bagoas was playing his deadly game of musical thrones in Persia, the world to the west had changed forever. The fractious Greek city-states had been brutally unified by a brilliant, one-eyed king from the semi-barbaric northern kingdom of Macedonia, Philip II, and after Philip was assassinated, his throne passed to his 20-year-old son, a military genius of terrifying ambition, a man who had been tutored by Aristotle and who slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow. A storm was gathering in the west, and its name was Alexander. The final act was about to begin. It would not be a long, drawn-out decline, but a sudden, violent, and spectacular collapse. The confrontation was set between two men who were worlds apart. In one corner stood Darius III, the ruler of a vast, ancient, and wealthy empire, commanding armies drawn from 24 nations. In the other stood Alexander of Macedon, the young king of a small, battle-hardened nation, leading a relatively small but fanatically loyal army of professional soldiers. It was a clash between the old world and the new, between inherited power and earned genius. Alexander crossed the Hellespont in 334 before the Common Era, declaring himself on a mission of Hellenic revenge. His first encounter with the Persians at the Granicus River was a stunning victory that liberated Ionia and opened up all of Anatolia to him. Darius, underestimating the young king, did not take the threat seriously enough at first. But a year later, at Issus, he met Alexander in person, commanding a massive Persian army. The battle was a tactical masterpiece by Alexander. He identified a weakness in the Persian line, led a cavalry charge directly at Darius's position, and shattered the Persian center. Darius, seeing the battle was lost, panicked and fled, abandoning his wife, his mother, and his children on the battlefield. It was a personal humiliation from which he would never recover. After Issus, Alexander turned south, systematically capturing the Phoenician port cities to neutralize the Persian navy before moving into Egypt, where he was welcomed as a liberator and crowned pharaoh. Meanwhile, Darius had scraped together another, even larger army from the eastern provinces of his empire. He chose a wide, flat plain at Gaugamela near modern-day Mosul in Iraq as the site for the final, decisive battle. It was a battlefield perfectly suited for his scythed chariots and superior numbers. He would not make the same mistake as at Issus. But Alexander was not a general who made the same move twice. The Battle of Gaugamela in 331, before the Common Era, was his greatest tactical victory. Facing overwhelming odds, he used an unorthodox strategy, advancing with his army in an oblique formation, drawing the Persian cavalry on the left flank out of position. This created a small gap in the Persian line. Into that gap, Alexander led his elite companion cavalry in a desperate all-or-nothing charge aimed directly, once again, at Darius himself. For the second time, Darius fled the battlefield, and with the flight of the king, the Persian army, the largest ever assembled by the Achaemenids, lost its nerve and disintegrated. The battle was over, the empire was lost, the road to the heartland was now open. Alexander marched into Babylon, which surrendered without a fight, just as it had to Cyrus 2 centuries earlier. He then moved on to Susa, the administrative capital, seizing a treasury so vast it was said to be beyond counting. His final destination was the ceremonial and spiritual heart of the empire, Persepolis. He entered the magnificent city, the symbol of Achaemenid power, and took up residence in the palace of Xerxes. What happened next is a subject of intense debate. After several weeks of feasting during a drunken party, the great palace complex of Persepolis was set on fire and burned to the ground. Was it a drunken act of vandalism, as some ancient sources claim, or was it a cold, calculated act of political theatre? A symbolic gesture to show the world, and especially the Greeks, that the Persian Empire was well and truly dead, a final, definitive act of revenge for the burning of Athens by Xerxes 150 years earlier. While Persepolis burned, Darius III was a fugitive, fleeing eastward, pursued relentlessly by Alexander. His own satraps, seeing that the cause was lost, betrayed and murdered him, leaving his body on the side of the road to be found by the Macedonian vanguard. Alexander, who had wanted to capture Darius alive, gave him a royal burial next to his ancestors. The last king of kings was dead. The Achaemenid Empire, the first true world empire, the state that had dominated the world for 220 years, was no more. But an empire is more than its kings and its palaces. It is an idea, and the idea of Persia would not die in the flames of Persepolis. It would be absorbed by its conqueror, and through him it would shape the future of a world he had yet to build. Alexander the Great burned Persepolis to the ground, a symbolic act to erase the memory of the Achaemenid kings. And yet nearly 2.5 millennia later, the ideas of Cyrus the Great, of human rights, religious tolerance and a multicultural state, feel more relevant than ever. So tell us, what do you believe is the true legacy of an empire? The blinding flame of its spectacular fall, or the quiet voice of its ideas that continues to echo through the centuries? Write your choice in the comments. Your perspective helps write the next chapter of history.